Today, we're going to talk about midtone contrast, what it is, and how understanding it can take your images to the next level. So you're probably already familiar with the contrast slider in Lightroom and how changing it can impact your image. We're going to touch on that just a little bit here in a moment, but what the core of this video is going to be about is how to use Lightroom tools to target that midtone contrast. And we'll talk a little bit about why you'd want to target just those midtones instead of globally apply it to the whole image. But let's start with contrast. The contrast slider in Lightroom, when using it without any masks or anything like that, it's going to affect the whole image. And when you increase it, it's going to make the difference between the brights in the image and the darks in the image greater. It's going to add contrast. It's going to make the difference bigger. And that can give an image a little bit of punch, but it can very easily be overdone and make it too contrasty, too big of a difference, and just give it this over-edited look. You can also use the contrast slider and move it down, which is going to reduce the difference between those brights and the darks and give it a slightly more muted tone, a little more flat tone, a soft look, if you will. So that's really what the contrast slider in Lightroom is doing. It's playing with how big of a difference is there between the lighter colors, the highlights, and the darker colors, the darks, in the image. Increasing it makes that difference bigger, gives a little bit of oomph, and decreasing it makes that difference a little less, which makes the image seem more muted. So let's take a look at this image from the Rocky Mountain National Park. It's a black and white image and has a couple elements of high contrast in it. In that immediate foreground, there's a lot of contrast there. It's a high contrast. It's got the bright white of the snow compared to the dark shadows of the trees. And that's very high contrast. The brights are super bright, the darks are super dark, and there's just a big gap between the two, which gives it this high contrast look. So we move further into the scene, it actually transitions into sort of a lower contrast image. The clouds were rolling across, and the difference between the snow on some of the mountain peaks there towards the back and the dark ridges is not as great. It's lower contrast. So within this image, there's actually a high contrast element and a low contrast. But then when you look at the picture as a whole, we sort of get another element of high contrast, and my foreground is a big contrast against my background. So this is a reasonable example of a high contrast image where the brights are bright, the darks are dark, and here, the foreground stands out against the background because of the contrast, because of the boldness of the front ridge compared to the mutedness of the back ridges back there. Now, if we take a look at the histogram on this image, we can sort of see we get these horns. We've got the bump down here in the darks on the left-hand side of the histogram, showing us that we've got lots of powerful darks. Those are going to be those trees there in the front. Then we have a nice valley of midtones there, very evenly distributed, very muted, not a lot of contrast, very even color. And then we got the highlights, which is going to be that snow and some of the sky in the background there. And so we get that horn look, we've got that dip, that valley look. And that's showing us we've got big difference between our brightest parts of the image and darkest parts of the image, leading to a high contrast image. If we flip over to the next image, this is going to be a low contrast image. And this is where there's not a lot of difference between our brights and our darks. And yes, you can see there's shadows in these sand dunes, but there's not a big difference. It's similar to the highlights. And if we look at the histogram, it's even more evident. Unlike the other picture we looked at where we had the valley between the brights and the darks, here everything is in the middle. It's all flat. There's not a big difference between the brights and the darks in this image, and that's sort of a low contrast image. Gives you this muted, soft look, which can be very pleasing. There's no right or wrong way. Some people might lean towards high contrast images, some might lean towards low contrast, and some might vary depending on scene and which seems most appropriate for it. But those are your examples of a high contrast image and a low contrast image. So now that we've looked at those example images, why would you not just want to apply contrast globally? Well, as you start to apply that contrast, increasing those brights, making the darks darker, that applies to the whole image, and you start to lose the details in those highlights and those darks, causing problems. So if you're really trying to get those midtones to stand out, but you're using the contrast slider, because it's a global change and it's impacting the whole image, starts to cause problems in those other areas, causing you to lose detail. That's why learning how to adjust just the midtone contrast is important. Because if we can figure out how to target those midtones and not touch those highlights, not touch those shadows, that'll give us a tool to sort of add some depth and some detail to an image very subtly in a way that makes the image pop without looking over-edited and get just a more pleasing image overall. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at Lightroom. I'm going to show you 2 ways that you can adjust midtone contrast in Lightroom. Okay, so we're going to dive in here into Lightroom. We're going to take an image that's sort of on the high dynamic range side of things. We're going to walk through why the main contrast slider in Lightroom causes problems with this image, as well as those 2 ways that you can use Lightroom to just focus in on the midtones. So what we've got here is we've got this image pulled up, Rocky Mountain National Park. And as you can see, it's a high dynamic range. We've got like sort of a bright sky. We've got these dark trees down here. And we've got this big area of midtones sitting right here. Now this is the before image. A lot of times my standard course of action in editing of photos, I sort of even things out. So if I pull a photo in that looks like this, high dynamic range, I sort of even it out, I flatten it out, so then I can do more targeted adjustments as to where I want the contrast, where I can fix the shadows, make sure my highlights are under control and everything like that. So the problem areas with this, mainly we're here in the trees. They're dark, too shadowy, and I really can't get some of that detail out of there, which I think is somewhat interesting. So I did a sort of a base edit. These were all global edits. If we take a quick look, we can see I'm just sort of evening contrast out. I pulled the exposure up a touch. I made a tweak to the white balance and just generally evened it out. So now I've got the detail back in these trees down here at the bottom. I can see a little bit in there. They're still dark, but as doing that, as we can see, I did lose some of the contrast out of the image, and the contrast does help the image out. So if I want to just use the contrast slider in Lightroom and I come over here and I increase it a fair amount to get that contrast back in there, I lose my detail on my shadows. These trees are already being problematic. Let's look one more time. Contrast at 0, I get a little bit of detail. I can see those trees. I can see what's in there. If I crank that up, you can watch. It goes dark. I just lose too much in there. It helps here in this portion of the mountains. It gives me the contrast in the brights and the darks. The sky wasn't too problematic here. It gets a little brighter, but I don't actually blow it out. It's really the problem is down here in the shadows. So how do I get my contrast in here, essentially the midtones, without impacting everything else? So let's set this back here. I actually have a spare copy of this image over here. And you see, this is sort of flattened out. I've even actually reduced the contrast slider just a touch more, just to give me a very flat, even image. And my goals with this image are to keep the detail in the trees, don't blow out the sky, but get some contrast back in this mountain range here. First way to do this is you can use the tone curve. And the tone curve is just down here underneath the tone curve section. And we've got this line. And by pulling down this line, I will make this area of the tone curve darker. And the left side is the darks, the right side is the brights. And so if we look here and I pull this down, we can see I get those darks down, puts a little curve in, and I can bring this up. The way I've just sort of haphazardly done this is a little more akin to the contrast slider and bringing it in. If I want to do this a little more precise, set that back to linear, what I can do is I can just sort of target the midtones, which would be right about here, but we can check that by clicking this little button over here, and it gives us a little eyedropper. And as you look, you can see on the line there what tonal value we're in. So here in this snow, it's up there towards the right. If we come over here to the darks, we're down there a little lower. So if I'm aiming, shadowy snow, that puts me about there. If I go to the darks, it puts me about there. So if I come over here and I set my points on the tone curve, and I want to add a little contrast. So what I'm doing here with this curve is I'm just aiming to try to affect those midtones. So I can pull this down a little bit. And if you watch the mountainside, those darks down there get a little darker. Bring those highlights up. And you can see there's no tone curve. There's tone curve. I've added some contrast to those midtones here. And you can see the S of my line. I've pretty much left the darkest of the darks undisturbed and the brightest of the brights undisturbed. Now I did lose a little bit of detail in the trees. And so because of that, I can come in and just sort of, correct this up, bring it up just a little bit more to get some of that back. So this isn't too bad of a way to do it. You can use that tone curve to sort of target the tones on this graph where you want. Again, this is representing the tonal values of the image. The left side is the darks. So over here is the darker parts of the image. It's going to be these trees. Over here is going to be the snow, sky, things like that. And I'm able to use the tone curve to sort of do that. Again, let's turn the tone curve off. There we go. Tone curve back on, and I get that contrast. So again, I've been able to use the tone curve to target those midtones to do it. Now, the tone curve is a super powerful tool. It can be somewhat imprecise, in my opinion, compared to some of the new masking abilities that Lightroom's continue to add and enhance as we go on. So let's reset this back to what it was. Set it to a linear tone curve. And again, in that example, the sky hasn't been too problematic. If it wasn't for these clouds, the sky would probably start to be problematic, but I'm demonstrating mainly these shadows because in this particular image, when I start making global contrast changes, that's where I really start to see some of the problems. Let's look at the other way to do this, and that is to use masking. Again, Lightroom's got the masking. You can access it down here underneath this mask tool. It's a little circle. We're going to click it, and it's going to ask me what I want to change. And I've talked about masking in Lightroom in the past. We are specifically going to go down to the luminance range, and that's going to let me target a certain tonal value, a certain luminance range of things. And I'm going to aim to target just the midtones on this. So I choose luminance range, and I can use my dropper to drop in here. So let's say I want to go into this shadowy area. The green is highlighting where this mask is being applied to. So right now it's hitting a fair amount of these trees, getting a little bit into the sky. So these are the tones. I can change its feathering, change this, and maybe even just slide it a touch this way. And then I want to get it out of the sky, so we're going to bring the feather down to touch on that. So now I've predominantly affected this particular area of the image. And now I can come in and I can actually do just a contrast slider. As you can see, I'm affecting really just, look at, if I swing that and we watch the trees down here at the bottom, I've cranked contrast up to 100. It's a bit much here in the middle, but these trees did not get impacted, unlike when I was using the global slider. So that's one way to do it, is you can play with the contrast slider itself. Another way I like to do it is just come down here to the whites. I want to make the whites a little brighter. I want to make the blacks a little blacker. So we've used the whites and the blacks to sort of affect that area. We are going to add just a teeny bit of contrast to, just a little bit, nothing too much, just so you can see it in this video. It can be hard to see things without some sort of a little bit more than I would normally do changes. But here the mask is, again, the mask is targeting essentially this mountain range, the midtones. If I turn the mask off, we can see that sort of goes more flat. It loses its contrast. If I turn it on, I get the contrast back, and I have not affected the shadows in those trees. I've been able to adjust what I wanted to, the midtones, this mountain range, the contrast in it to give it a little bit more depth without impacting the shadows. Whereas when I was using the contrast slider in Lightroom and increasing it, yes, I fixed the mountains, but I also added too many shadows into those trees in the foreground. So that's how that can work. Now in this particular case, this is spilling over into the sky a little bit. So if I want to, I can come to this mask and I can subtract a little bit, and I can use my brush. And let's do this real haphazardly. I can just brush this out, and I can keep from impacting that sky. So by removing that sky, I've been able to refine my mask a little bit more and keep it out of the sky. So hopefully after watching this video, you see how adjusting just midtone contrast can help give your images a little bit of extra depth without losing those highlights and those shadow details in the image. It can be a pretty powerful tool and sort of take your landscape photo editing to the next step. So hopefully you found this video helpful, and if you did, be sure to hit that like button. And if you want to see future landscape photography content from me, including tips, tricks, behind the scenes, and mini gear reviews, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And thank you for watching.